If you enjoy this video, consider supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Click on the card in the upper right-hand corner for more information. Hey guys, this is Julian of Julian Gray Media. Today's video, I want to address a problem that I see very often in newer musicians, whether it be projects I fix on my Fix Your Project streams or personal sessions with my students. A problem I see in a lot of beginner musicians' music is a fundamental lack of understanding or association between the mixing stage and the production stage. Contrary to popular belief, getting a good mix is entirely dependent on good source material, good writing, and picking the right notes for your song. Mixing and production are inherently tied, especially in electronic music where one person generally does all of the jobs. So I want to show you why it's important to consider mixing while you write your music, and why you might consider revisiting your writing while you're mixing. Let's hop into Ableton so I can show you what I'm talking about. Sorry about the change in lighting. Something happened to my previous recording and I had to record this much later in the day. So to start things off, let's jump into Ableton here. And as you can see, I have a chord stack put together. This is just an A minor chord, A root, C3, the fifth is an E, and then we have a G with an octave, and then we have another A1 down here below the A2 to prove the concept. Altogether, that sounds like this. And to start things off, I want to illustrate to you the relationship between a note and a frequency. And to do that, what I'm going to do is just disable, all the accessory notes of this chord. I'm just going to grab the root note, which is an A. And then we're going to go into Serum here. It's just an initialized preset for now, but I'm going to switch it over to a sine wave, which is the least harmonically rich of all of the wave shapes. In fact, it is the only harmonic-less wave shape, and it's actually just the fundamental. So if we actually grab an EQ like this, and we play the note, you'll see, as you can see some activity on the spectrum here. And this is probably pretty clear. You guys probably have a brief understanding of this is the high end, this is the high mid, this is the mid, this is like the low end, and then your subs down here. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the frequencies you see directly correlate or translate to notes. So if we play this and we're playing a sine wave, which is a single frequency with no harmonics, this is what we get. As you can see, we can kind of look over, this is about 12.5 decibels. It's 110 hertz. I'm looking down here at this little meter right here, as you can see. Like 110 hertz, 12.5 decibels. But in the middle there, in between, you can actually see the A1. And this is directly correlated to a musical note. So if we look at the MIDI key we're actually playing the A1. And as you can see, the frequency that we're playing is an A1. Now wait a second. Now that we know that every note corresponds to a frequency, let's say that we want to mix a bass sound with our pad sound, and we want to remove 100 hertz from our pad to make space for our bass sound. If your bass is playing down here at this, octave C1 to C2, a lot of people tend to do this, where you'll, grab an EQ, you do a low shelf, and you just shelf off the bottom. It's not directly apparent now because this is a harmonic-less wave shape, but let's go ahead and switch it to something a little bit more interesting. So let's grab like a saw wave, where you have all these frequencies above here. If we apply that EQ curve I was going to do to make room for that bass, for example, in your pad, this is what happens. So we've removed the fundamental, which in theory will create space for our bass, but look at all this that's left over. All these harmonics that are from the overtone series of this note that are still in there. And this will occur whenever you use any wave shape or any sort of sound that's more harmonically rich than a sine wave. And there's very few applications for just using a sine wave. You almost always have something a little bit more harmonically rich. It doesn't sound as interesting when you're just using straight up sine waves and only fundamentals. You either distort the sine wave to add some harmonics up on the top. You might use a saw wave so that you use, this series of harmonics here, you might use a triangle. So you have, this scarce system of harmonics above. You might try a square, where you have alternating volumes of harmonics above, but you almost never use just a sine wave. So what happens is, when you do this to your sound, and for the sake of example here, let me re-enable these notes. What happens when you high pass and you remove that low note to make room for your bass? Sure, you have all of the high end, but you also have all of the harmonics of this fundamental still in here, and you end up with a sound that sounds like it's lost its foundation. If we just go back to that single note again, you hear how constrained that sounds? It feels like a sound that's lost its integrity. It doesn't have a foundation to stand on anymore. As you bring in that fundamental, it feels like the sound fills out, because it's all these harmonics are just harmonics of the original fundamental. So back to the analogy. If we're trying to remove that note from our pad to make room for our bass, there's a better solution than high passing, and I think you probably realize what it is now. And it's something that's truly obvious once you realize it, but something that a lot of musicians just don't see. If we just remove the A1 note, we've essentially done the same thing as high passing. We've just removed all of the cluttered frequencies up in this top spectrum. And now the sound doesn't sound constrained because there aren't those harmonics in there that are missing their fundamental. I'll go ahead and A-B high passing with that unnecessary fundamental in the low end versus just removing the note initially. And you can hear how much of a stark difference it is. So to start things off, let's play it with the note. I'm going to go ahead and remove it. And as you can see, even though we're cutting that low end, you can still hear the remnants of it in the harmonics. See how much noisier that sounds? So when you think you're removing a frequency with an EQ like this, it might actually be an illusion. You're only removing the fundamental, and all of its harmonics are still in the sound. So the solution I find, and I find a lot of musicians do, is to write their music so that it's harmonically compatible. And one of the really interesting things about this now is that if we actually remove that A1 note, there's actually no need for an EQ at all, if we're trying to only balance it with the bass, of course. So if we remove the EQ, and then we put in essentially another note down there at A1, go ahead and do that really quick. These two sounds blend together nicely without any competition, because fundamentally, the fundamental of A1 isn't in the pad. So that fundamental of A1 in the bass has enough space to shine. You should never play too many sounds playing the same fundamental note or the fundamental frequency of that note at any given time. You're trying to shoehorn multiple elements into the same note, and you end up with a very cluttered, muddy sounding, compromised sound. You never end up with a really clean sound. So I always like to leave space in my arrangements. So like if I look here, I know that this A1 is filling out my low end in the bass. So I don't want to include that A1 in my pad. And vice versa, if I added a sub, I would put a sub down here at A0, and I know that it's not going to conflict with A1 or A2, because in terms of frequency, they will never compete. If I look at this now, and we put that EQ back, our pad only gets as low as 220, which is the first fundamental of the series, which is at A2. And everything below that is non-existent. You could low pass this just for optics and peace of mind, but fundamentally this is no different than this. Let me go ahead and do that with only the one selected. Yeah, It's optically good to look at, but it actually functionally does nothing. You might remove some, pops or clicks and micro sounds that come on your output when you're exporting or something, but in principle and in technique, this is the same as this. And that means functionally, you don't need to high pass if your notes are harmonically compatible. So the reason this is important is if you write music that's harmonically compatible and the notes don't overlap and your sounds all fit within their own space, you don't need to do as much EQ. You don't need to correct problems, and you don't have all of those harmonic runoffs that you would have if you had the fundamental in there and you tried to remove the fundamental later. The only way to truly remove a fundamental is if I went in here and I found every single harmonic of that A1 and removed them. If I just muted these here, I would have to find every single one of these lines up the spectrum to effectively remove that A1. And what that does is it just destroys the integrity of the overarching sound, because some of these might overlap with other notes in the chord. And then with a little bit of sound design, if we trimmed off some of the high end from this bass, and then we maybe add some voices to this, we end up with a really nice sounding pad and bass with just 2 channels that sound harmonically rich and full and fill the arrangement out nicely, because they're all filling their own space within the harmonic spectrum with no note overlap. Just get rid of this. And then you can take this a step further with another channel, maybe drop this down an octave again. That's your sub. Let's go ahead and highlight all 3 of these so you can visualize it. You can see here's our sub, here's our bass, and here's our top pad chord. And together they sound like this. And then maybe we can give it a little bit more high end. And we have a very full sounding arrangement with 3 channels, because they're all comprising their own octaves, playing a note within their own respective octaves. If you think of this in terms of real music, the reason why a 4-piece band dynamic with a vocalist, guitarist, bass player, and a drummer exists, with the exception of the drummer who just kind of keeps the rhythm, is because all 3 of those instruments fit within their own octaves. The bass is comprising that 0 to 2. The guitar is taking from 2 to like 4 or 3, and then the vocal is like 3, 4, 5 if you have a especially high vocalist. And it's also the reason why you never have a lead guitarist playing against a singer, because they're in the same octave and they're directly competing with each other for that space. So I hope this helped you guys. If it did, make sure to give the video a like. Make sure to give it a dislike. If it didn't, let me know why in the comment section below. If you have any ideas for future videos, let me know down there as well. I had a student this week that had this problem, and I figured it would be a great video for you guys. I hope it did help you guys. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe. I'm Julian of Julian Gray Media, and I'll talk to you in the next video. Bye-bye.